Hi everyone, welcome back. It's very good to see you. And before we get started, I'd like to say that if you like the video, please like the video and consider subscribing. Would love to have you join this community. And today, the game we're going to talk about is SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated. So this is a remake of Battle for Bikini Bottom, a title originally developed by Heavy Iron Studios, who was known for doing some licensed titles. You know, they worked on an Evil Dead game. That's pretty cool. Scooby-Doo, Ratatouille, The Incredibles. And so, as you can tell, they were really into this whole licensed gaming infrastructure of the time, which was very big in the 2000s. The game was published by THQ. And this game came out in the mid-2000s originally. And this rehydrated version was developed by a developer I'm not actually too familiar with, Purple Lamp Studios, and it was published by THQ Nordic now. And Purple Lamp Studios went on to work on Cosmic Shake, which is a 2023 SpongeBob game, kind of in a similar fashion to this one. And they worked on doing they worked on a port for Sea of Thieves and an Epic Mickey remaster, and so that's kind of their portfolio of games. So yeah, SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom. Game did pretty well in its sales. It sold about 2 million units. I'm assuming that's why they said, hey, we got to greenlight a sequel. get to work on it, guys. And you know, it did review pretty average overall. However, I even saw a review on GameSpot, which was listed in some of the wiki details for this game, where they gave it a 2 out of 10, just basically citing that the game didn't do too much to really grow up and above its original. And I think primarily because critically there was a lot of pushback on the fact that this game was a remake. It wasn't a remaster necessarily. And the assumption being, well, you would imagine a remake to go above and beyond what its original did. And there's some refutations you can make to that. I mean, Demon's Souls is basically like a one-to-one with just a remade, you know, visual look and so on, but we won't get into the details there. We're here to talk about SpongeBob. So the game was initially began development in 2018. THQ had brought Purple Lamp on, and they announced, hey, we're going to do a bunch of these revitalizations for old Nickelodeon games. And so this was kind of one of the first big ones, getting a little bit of an announcement and some testing out there in 2019, and then ultimately releasing in 2020. One of the things I found to be pretty interesting when I was reading about this game and its development history was that the Purple Lamp Studios actually used a modder's tool called, what was that tool called? Industrial Park is what it was called. And it was a way to rip the original game's levels out so that they could then be, you know, touched up and whatever. So, you know, that was pretty interesting. And I also thought one thing that was funny about this game is it supports a ton of languages, both audio and text. And so we'll talk a little bit about that later. Before we dive into the game, let's look at the packaging here. So on the front, you have SpongeBob, Patrick Star, and Sandy. I grew up watching a lot of SpongeBob. It was a pretty wacky show. I did like it. And on the spine here, actually in a very, very small text, we see the title. I kind of wish it was bigger. It doesn't really stand out on a shelf too much. And then on the back here, this is actually, I believe, probably the Canadian release, because we have Canada French on here as well. A couple little pictures of the various people you'll play as, and then this giant block of legal text, which seems to pervade modern games. On the inside, again, we just simply have the disc, one of the saddest parts of modern gaming and collecting physical games. And the disc is essentially just the same picture as what we see on the front. So let's set this aside and let's talk about the game. So the story is pretty straightforward. Plankton, he's on a mission to steal the secret Krabby Patty formula, as always, and in his mission to do so, he creates an army of robots that'll help him take it. But unfortunately, on his machine, he had it set to do not obey mode. And so now the robots have kind of wreaked havoc and destroyed Bikini Bottom and are terrorizing the citizens of Bikini Bottom. And so as SpongeBob, you're kind of on a mission to clean up the mess. And your reward will be, I don't know. The gameplay is pretty typical of a platformer collectathon. You know, you'll go from level to level. Each level will have kind of a main overarching mission. So you might be defeating the Jellyfish King on the top of a big hill. That sounds very, very original. I mean, that's like Super Mario 64, first level right off the bat. And Jellyfish Fields, you know, Bomb Field, I think, or whatever. Or you might be, you know, looking for missing students in the kelp forest, or fighting Robo Sandy. And so these are kind of some of the overarching main missions, and then throughout you'll explore around, and you'll pick up all sorts of little goodies, I guess. In the level, there's of course robots to defeat, and each character of the three has a standard just attack move. It's not very deep. It's not like something like Banjo-Kazooie where you're picking up and learning special skills along the way, though characters have their little unique skills to their character that will become useful for retraversing levels and finding secret areas you couldn't reach before, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the things is that, yeah, you're going to need to switch characters around as you're playing through to get to certain areas, get to certain things, but you can't do it on the fly. You know, you'll have to go find a bus stop, and from the bus stop you can switch characters. I thought it would have been nice if you could do it with some level of immediacy. I think it would heighten the puzzle aspect of the game and kind of solving some objective or trying to get someplace. Because with the bus stop being there, whenever you're running through an area and you see a bus stop, well, it's a clear call sign to you that, like, oh, I need to switch my character. And you cannot, basically when you're in the main hub choosing a level, you are SpongeBob, and then each level there's only one character you can switch to. So it does kind of limit the creative freedom of the player to go around and try to solve puzzles and missions, you know, at their convenience or whatnot. So the big core thing you're going to collect is golden spatulas. These operate similar to your jigsaw puzzles or your stars and so on, as we've seen in platformers before. And you know, I would say overall the first couple levels especially are pretty just standard and generic in their own way. Later the design gets more creative. I really like the kelp forest, for example. I like the Flying Dutchman's level, which is more linear but also very interesting just to explore and go through. In the gameplay world, I did have some strange glitches that happened occasionally, such as Sandy has a double jump skill that you'll have to implement from time to time. And oftentimes the animation on the second jump would freeze or like spasm out for me, and so basically you would just see kind of Sandy like floating up and things. Without that visual cueing, it's hard for the player to really gauge in a platformer, you know, the accuracy and the power and so on and so forth, the things they need to do to achieve a certain jump or what, so on and so forth. And so that was something I struggled with from time to time. Later in the game, the way the game increases the difficulty on the combat side is simply to increase the abundancy of enemies and how annoying they are to fight, essentially. And so you are going to take a lot of damage, at least in my experience. That was what I was doing, running through a SpongeBob, just getting hit left and right. But the game wasn't particularly challenging one way or another, just more feeling tedious and frustrating sometimes fighting these enemies. I also had a really weird glitch where there's a cruise missile skill that you'll need to use to solve certain objectives. And occasionally the controls for it would just freeze up and lock, and then of course you'd have to retry or whatnot, which was pretty frustrating. So those are kind of the big things. Another one that I thought was challenging is that there are some locked camera aspects, such as when you're jumping on bouncing objects, for instance, there's a locked camera aspect. So you know, the core part of a platformer is being able to jump with some degree of accuracy, and so locking the camera kind of makes that challenging, I'll be honest. But oh well, I mean, the game's pretty short and it's not too terrible overall, so what can I say in that field? So that's kind of the gameplay. You run around, you collect things, you have a simple attack move. Sometimes you change characters so you can solve certain objectives or get to certain places, and you pick up these golden spatulas along the way, and you collect these little, I don't even know what they are, a currency. They look like little sand dollars or whatever, and you can turn those in to buy, more golden spatulas. So that's basically it. And then when you finish the game, if you're like me, you've explored pretty broadly and you've gotten most of the golden spatulas, and you can go back and do a little cleanup. But ultimately, getting a platinum trophy in this game is pretty easy. There's not really a map, and so I did struggle at times to just navigate back through areas and figure out exactly where I was going. Maybe that's just a sign that I need to go back and enjoy some of these more old school collectathon experiences where a map wasn't necessarily a thing you were going to have. But overall, I did enjoy the gameplay. It was a good game to pop on and listen to a podcast and play through. But nothing really beyond that striking to me. But I did enjoy it. I've wanted to play this since it originally came out many console generations ago now. So it's nice to have that opportunity finally. In the sound space, the music is mostly surf rock or some like ukulele vibes type of music that's kind of happy-go-lucky or whatever. Definitely fits the SpongeBob aesthetic, though I would say that overall, feeling very SpongeBob-ish is going to make it just feel generic to the IP, and that's kind of how it landed. There are a couple of standout, interesting like electro songs and things like that, but they were sprinkled here or there. And these songs are going to play over your entire gameplay experience. And so you should learn to love them if you're going to pick up this game and play it. Now, one of the things that was nice is the voice acting is essentially all the original voice actors here returning to play these roles. I think one of the only ones that really stands out to me that I could tell didn't have its original voice actor was Mr. Krabs. But fortunately, your exposure to him throughout the game is pretty limited. And it sounded like the developers did try to get the original voice actor for Mr. Krabs to come, voice the game, but there were some, legal, logistical issues that kind of pervaded and getting in the way. So, now one of the things that is very funny, I was saying earlier, this game has a lot of language support. So a couple hours in, I decided I was just going to play the game in Japanese. And I actually very much recommend this experience because SpongeBob Japanese voice actor is incredible, and it's really funny to hear them pronouncing the English words throughout using more of a Japanese dialect. There's certain words that are written in katakana that come and originate from the Western world, and so Japanese people pronounce it phonetically like a Japanese word, but it's really the root is the English word. So I'm just saying I had a lot of fun just going through this game as Japanese SpongeBob. But there's also French, and there's, I think, German and Spanish, and so I was just kind of flipping through and just having an enjoyable time having that experience, I guess, so to speak. So I'd recommend that if you pick this game up. I think it elevates the gaming experience. But overall, the voice acting was good. I mean, whether you play it in English or Japanese, that was my experience. The voice acting holds up for what the game is meant to be. Outside of that, sound effects, I mean, nothing particularly stood out to me necessarily. And on a quality basis, the audio sounded fine. There wasn't no huge issues or problems with compression or bitrate or quality or whatever, at least in my perspective. And last big thing to share is kind of graphically what I think about the game. So the game was developed on Unreal 4, but I would say it doesn't look particularly fancy. I think the art style tries to maintain some level of integrity with the original, and so that's going to hold it back in a couple ways. I think the first being that visually and kind of technically the game is 20 years old, and the level design and visuals of the levels definitely follow that. I mean, especially since they pulled the levels out using a modding tool and kind of recreated them from there. And otherwise, I think presentation-wise, the game just looks SpongeBob-ish. I mean, what else do you want me to say? It looks like a SpongeBob game. The one thing that does kind of, I always think, look weird and funky is Unreal Engine 4 is a pretty realistic looking engine that you can work with. the 3D models in here are representation of 2D cartoons. And so oftentimes I thought the models looked kind of freaky at times because they're not meant to be in 2D. So when you, or in 3D, so when you translate them from 2D, it can look a little weird to some degree. But aside from that, nothing too challenging visually, no visual glitches or anything. I thought overall the game looked pretty colorful and fun. And so those are kind of my big thoughts and perspectives of the game. I plugged through this game in maybe 6 hours, 7 hours. The story was kind of just sitting in the background because I was here listening to podcasts, but how much do you need to know? I mean, SpongeBob is just, he's killing robots and trying to stop Plankton from stealing the Krabby Patty secret formula. I mean, there's nothing too advanced to philosophize about in its story. The gameplay was enjoyable. It's been a minute since I played a collectathon, so it was just kind of fun to go do some light platforming and pick things up and just check off lists, essentially, that I got everything in a level. And I loved the Japanese voice acting, so shout out to the voice actor. And the game looked fine. It looked what you would expect out of a SpongeBob game. I don't have nostalgia for the original game, so that's a factor I can't really input here. But I thought the game was just it was a decent gaming experience that preoccupied me for a handful of hours. So, all right, well, those are my big thoughts. Have you played the original, or have you played this rehydrated version of SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom? I'd love to hear your perspective and your thoughts on the game. And otherwise, just want to say, as always, I really appreciate you tuning in, and please like and subscribe. And I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, stay well and healthy. All right, guys. See you later.